Jung's most terrifying realization wasn't about mental illness. It was about the one psychological mistake that destroys even the strongest minds, and how avoiding it became the difference between breakthrough and breakdown. In 1913, Jung discovered what he called the most dangerous psychological trap, one that catches brilliant individuals at their peak and pulls them into what he documented as complete psychological collapse. Today, I'll reveal Jung's most critical discovery about the one thing you must do to avoid a psychological breakdown, and why he believed this single practice determines whether extraordinary minds survive or shatter. If you're ready to discover the most essential psychological insights, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss content that could transform your understanding of the human mind. The case that revealed Jung's most critical discovery began with his own near breakdown in 1913 during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Jung had just severed his professional relationship with Freud, lost his academic standing, and found himself flooded with overwhelming psychological material from his own unconscious. Jung wrote in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, "I was menaced by a psychosis and was saved only by my ability to understand what was happening to me." But Jung realized his salvation came not from understanding alone, but from one specific practice that he later identified as the ultimate protection against psychological collapse. Jung discovered that the individuals who suffered complete breakdowns, despite possessing extraordinary psychological insight, had one thing in common. They had lost what he called conscious discrimination, the ability to distinguish between their own psychological contents and the overwhelming material emerging from the unconscious. Jung wrote in his Red Book period notes, "The greatest danger to consciousness is not the unconscious itself, but the inability to maintain conscious relationship with unconscious contents." Jung observed that brilliant minds often possess what he called superior intuitive function, the ability to perceive psychological patterns and unconscious contents with startling clarity. But this gift becomes dangerous when individuals lose the capacity to distinguish between what belongs to their own psyche and what they're absorbing from external sources or unconscious projection. Modern research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive persons validates Jung's early observations. Her studies show that individuals with heightened sensitivity often struggle with what she calls emotional contagion, absorbing others' emotional states so completely they lose contact with their own authentic feelings. But Jung identified something more specific and more dangerous. Jung documented patients who possessed what he called undifferentiated perception, the ability to see unconscious contents clearly, but without the psychological structure to process this information consciously. These individuals would become flooded with psychological material they couldn't organize or integrate, leading to what Jung called participation mystique, a state where psychological boundaries dissolve and the individual becomes merged with unconscious contents. Jung wrote, "The danger lies not in perceiving unconscious contents, but in becoming identified with them, rather than maintaining conscious relationship to them." Jung realized that avoiding psychological breakdown required one essential practice that he called conscious differentiation, the daily discipline of distinguishing between your authentic inner experience and the psychological material you encounter from external sources. Jung developed what he called the discrimination practice, a systematic approach to maintaining conscious relationship with unconscious contents. The practice involves 4 essential components. Component 1. Daily solitude periods. Jung wrote, "Without regular periods of complete solitude, the psyche cannot distinguish between its own voice and the voices of others." Jung instructed his patients to spend at least 30 minutes daily in complete isolation, allowing absorbed psychological material to settle so they could recognize their own authentic psychological voice. During these periods, individuals would ask themselves what thoughts, feelings, and perceptions genuinely belonged to their own inner world versus what they had unconsciously absorbed from their environment. Jung observed, "The individual who never spends time alone never learns to recognize their own psychological signature." Component 2, Conscious Boundary Maintenance. Jung taught what he called psychological container work, the practice of consciously choosing when to engage with others' psychological contents and when to maintain protective boundaries. Jung wrote, "The highly perceptive individual must learn to turn their perception on and off consciously, rather than remaining constantly open to unconscious influence." This involves developing what Jung called the observer function, the ability to witness psychological phenomena without becoming absorbed into them. Individuals learn to notice when they're beginning to merge with others' emotional states and consciously choose to maintain their own psychological center. Component 3, Regular reality testing. Jung emphasized the importance of what he called conscious verification, regularly checking your perceptions and interpretations with trusted individuals who can provide objective feedback. Jung wrote, "The isolated mind becomes prey to its own projections. Regular contact with conscious others serves as essential reality testing for psychological accuracy." Jung observed that individuals who avoid psychological breakdown maintain relationships with what he called conscious witnesses, people capable of engaging with their perceptions without becoming defensive or overwhelmed. Component 4, Creative expression outlets. Jung discovered that individuals with superior perception need regular channels for processing and expressing the overwhelming psychological material they encounter. Jung wrote, "The psyche requires creative outlets for unconscious contents, or these contents will find destructive expression through psychological symptoms." Jung encouraged his patients to engage in active imagination, artistic expression, writing, or other creative practices that allowed them to process unconscious material consciously rather than being overwhelmed by it. Jung documented the devastating consequences when individuals neglect this essential practice. He observed 3 distinct patterns of breakdown among highly perceptive individuals. Pattern 1, Psychological inflation. Jung wrote extensively about what happens when individuals become identified with their superior perception rather than maintaining conscious relationship to it. In 2 essays on analytical psychology, he warned, "The ego becomes inflated with archetypal contents, leading to a grandiose sense of special purpose that cuts the individual off from human relationships." He observed that inflated individuals begin believing they possess special knowledge or abilities that make them fundamentally different from others. They lose the capacity for conscious discrimination between their own psychological contents and the archetypal material they're channeling. Pattern 2, Paranoid projection. Jung documented cases where individuals with superior perception became convinced that others were deliberately targeting them because of their abilities. While Jung acknowledged that highly perceptive individuals do face social challenges, he distinguished between realistic social difficulties and paranoid projection of internal psychological conflicts. Jung wrote, "When conscious discrimination fails, the individual begins projecting internal psychological conflicts onto external relationships, creating persecutory delusions that feel completely real." Pattern 3, Complete withdrawal. Jung observed that some individuals with overwhelming perception retreat entirely from social engagement, convincing themselves that others are too unconscious to be worth engaging. Jung recognized this as psychological defeat rather than wisdom, writing, "True individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not escape from it." Jung's breakthrough came when he realized that avoiding psychological breakdown isn't about suppressing superior perception or withdrawing from psychological complexity. The solution lies in developing conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities through disciplined discrimination practice. Jung wrote in The Development of Personality, "The privilege of consciousness is not the ability to perceive everything, but the ability to remain conscious while perceiving everything." Jung observed that individuals who successfully navigate superior perception without breakdown share one essential characteristic. They maintain what he called conscious humility about their abilities, recognizing that perception is a tool for understanding rather than a source of identity or superiority. Jung documented his own integration process during his confrontation with the unconscious. He wrote, "I learned to approach unconscious contents with the attitude of a scientist rather than a mystic, maintaining conscious discrimination even while opening to extraordinary psychological material." Jung developed what he called active imagination, a systematic method for engaging consciously with unconscious contents without losing psychological boundaries. Through this practice, Jung maintained his capacity for conscious discrimination even while exploring the deepest layers of the collective unconscious. Jung's most important insight was that psychological breakdown occurs not because individuals encounter overwhelming psychological material, but because they lose conscious relationship with this material. The solution isn't to see less or feel less, but to maintain conscious awareness of what you're seeing and feeling. Jung wrote, "Consciousness is not about controlling unconscious contents, but about remaining conscious while engaging with unconscious contents." Jung observed that individuals who practice conscious discrimination daily develop what he called psychological resilience, the ability to remain centered and functional even while processing extraordinary psychological complexity. These individuals don't experience fewer challenging psychological phenomena, but they maintain conscious relationship with challenging phenomena rather than becoming overwhelmed by them. Jung emphasized that this practice becomes more crucial as perceptive abilities develop. Jung wrote, "The more differentiated one's perception becomes, the more essential conscious discrimination becomes for psychological survival." Jung documented cases where individuals avoided complete breakdown by implementing discrimination practice even during psychological crisis. One patient, whom Jung described as possessing extraordinary intuitive perception, learned to distinguish between her own authentic psychological voice and the overwhelming psychological material she absorbed from others. Through daily solitude periods and conscious boundary work, she developed what Jung called integrated superior function, the ability to use her perception consciously without being overwhelmed by it. Jung wrote about her transformation. The patient learned not to perceive less, but to perceive more consciously. Her superior function became an integrated tool for understanding rather than an overwhelming burden. Jung realized that conscious discrimination isn't just protective practice for individuals with superior perception. It's essential psychological hygiene for anyone seeking to develop consciousness without sacrificing psychological stability. Jung wrote in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, "The privilege of consciousness requires the discipline of consciousness. One cannot develop psychological awareness without simultaneously developing conscious relationship to psychological awareness." Jung observed that individuals who neglect conscious discrimination often experience what he called regression of consciousness, where increased psychological sensitivity leads to decreased functional capacity rather than enhanced understanding. The practice of conscious discrimination prevents this regression by maintaining the ego's capacity to function consciously, even while engaging with complex psychological material. Jung's ultimate insight was that avoiding psychological breakdown isn't about limiting your psychological development or avoiding challenging psychological territory. The solution lies in approaching psychological development with the conscious discipline that prevents identification with psychological contents, rather than conscious relationship to psychological contents. Jung wrote, "The individuated person is not someone who avoids psychological complexity, but someone who engages with psychological complexity consciously." Jung believed that individuals who master conscious discrimination serve an essential function for collective psychological development. They demonstrate that it's possible to develop extraordinary psychological awareness without sacrificing functional capacity or psychological stability. Jung wrote in The Undiscovered Self, "The individual who learns to remain conscious while engaging with unconscious contents serves as a bridge between conscious and unconscious for the entire collective." Remember Jung's crisis in 1913, when he nearly lost his sanity to overwhelming unconscious material. Through disciplined conscious discrimination practice, Jung not only avoided complete breakdown, but transformed his psychological crisis into the foundation for his life's work. Jung wrote, "What threatened to destroy me became the source of my greatest contributions to human understanding." Jung's most critical discovery wasn't about the dangers of psychological development, but about the one essential practice that makes extraordinary psychological development sustainable. Conscious discrimination transforms potentially overwhelming psychological abilities into integrated tools for understanding and service. Your psychological sensitivity isn't a vulnerability requiring suppression. It's an advanced capacity requiring conscious development. The question isn't whether you should limit your psychological awareness to avoid breakdown. The question is whether you'll develop the discrimination skills necessary to maintain conscious relationship with extraordinary psychological abilities. Jung's discrimination practice offers the one thing you must do to avoid psychological breakdown while continuing to develop consciousness. From overwhelming perception to integrated awareness, from psychological vulnerability to conscious resilience, from dangerous sensitivity to functional wisdom. You weren't meant to suppress your psychological abilities to maintain stability. You were meant to develop conscious relationship with your psychological abilities, so they serve understanding rather than overwhelm consciousness. The world needs individuals who can perceive psychological complexity without being destroyed by it, who can engage with unconscious contents without losing conscious discrimination. Jung's essential practice transforms potential psychological breakdown into conscious breakthrough. Your sensitivity is not your weakness. Your unconscious relationship to your sensitivity is your weakness. Learn conscious discrimination, and you become exactly what Jung believed psychologically aware individuals were meant to be: bridges between conscious and unconscious, serving collective psychological development. Jung's most critical discovery wasn't that psychological development is dangerous. It's that psychological development without conscious discrimination is dangerous. The one thing you must do to avoid breakdown isn't to limit your psychological awareness, but to maintain conscious relationship with psychological awareness. You are not too sensitive for psychological development. You are exactly what consciousness evolution requires once you learn to engage with psychological complexity as consciously as Jung learned to engage with his own overwhelming unconscious material. The danger of psychological development isn't that it overwhelms you. It's that you might develop extraordinary psychological abilities without learning the conscious discrimination necessary to integrate them sustainably. If you recognize yourself in Jung's description of individuals prone to psychological overwhelm, you possess psychological capacities that require conscious development rather than suppression. Share in the comments your experience with maintaining conscious boundaries while developing psychological awareness. Subscribe for more insights into Jung's methods for developing consciousness without sacrificing psychological stability.